The Thoughtful Rebel's Guide to Economics by Louis Orth Kelso. The following lecture took place before the College Editors Conference, the United States Student Press Association, Washington, D.C., Saturday, February 15, 1969. The institutions of the world are not working satisfactorily for a large and growing proportion of the world's population, particularly the young, the minorities, and the poor. In particular, the old economic institutions all over the world are not working. As is always the case with human institutions, entrenched interests that are or think they are benefited by the established order have sprung up to protect it. Only the growing proportion of those who are shut out from participation in these institutions, particularly participation in economic institutions, can dependably be expected to overcome the resistance of the old order. It appears that most of the power and energy required to identify the defective institutions and to bring about their reform must come from youth today. The instincts of the young that societies are malfunctioning are good, but these instincts are not matched by the unerring ability to identify the defects. The negative case of youth for a new order, free of the profound deficiencies of the present order, is a good one. But youth's positive case for a new order is simply non-existent. It would be absurd to blame youth for this shortcoming. The ability to state that positive case requires ingredients that cannot by their very nature be normally found in youth. These include broad knowledge of the past and the present in literally dozens of complex fields of human endeavor, knowledge of the competing philosophies and the life goals that each espouses, an understanding of education and the relevance of different kinds of education to alternative life goals, an understanding of the difference between the urgent and the important in life, knowledge of the nature of wealth and its significance for particular life goals, knowledge of how wealth is actually produced in the world, the nature of technology and its meaning for man, an understanding of the significance of the chief institutions required in various kinds of successful societies and how these institutions function in their day-to-day activities, awareness of the relationship between the animal and the human sides of man's nature, knowledge of the relationship between toil, leisure, and play in the good life, an understanding of a sound philosophy of the relationship between man and the physical globe upon which he dwells, etc., etc. All these things and many, many more things must be accurately comprehended by those who would change the world for the better rather than for worse. I cannot give you wisdom, nor can anyone else. Fiercely hard and disciplined study of the evidence of life as a whole, the acquisition and interpretation of experience, and the acquisition of grace itself are required for that. But I can, using my own attributes, the results of my own study and my own experience as a teacher, a businessman, a lawyer, an economist, and a man who is successful by most of the world's standards, but who can never be content until effective opportunity for equal or better success is open to all, I can give you my analysis, my hypothesis as to where the basic defect lies. What I have to say is radically relevant. What I have to suggest can be easily accomplished while preserving and even enhancing virtually all the institutions of our society by merely orienting them towards a different economic goal. What I have to say relates only to a single area of life's activities. But when you carefully reflect upon it, you will know that making the change I suggest will have both profound and beneficial immediate and long-range effects on almost every aspect of human life. So let me state in the simplest form my hypothesis as to what is basically wrong with our society and how we can readily cure its single most pervasive defect. What I will say is childishly simple, radically simple. The world has structured its economies, and the business, labor, and financial institutions that form the operating units within its economies, as though only labor produces wealth, as though holding and performing an economic job for money is synonymous with being affluent, being not poor, as though equality of economic opportunity consisted merely of equal opportunity to get a job. as though only human toil could legitimate the receipt of income, as though the function of new capital formation in any economy is to create jobs, as though the productivity of labor with each advance in technology is rising, thus legitimating ever-rising wages and salaries, as though one who does not hold a job must be dependent upon a dole or the voluntary efforts of others to help him as the only possible alternative, as though a job-producing military overkill or napalm for natives is quite as good for the economy and the society as a job-producing shoes or housing or food, as though jobs created by setting the young of the world to slaughtering each other are quite as good for the economy as any other jobs, as though engineers, managers, and scientists all were dedicated to the pursuit of the goal of creating more jobs, as though the maximization of jobs to provide full employment is a sound goal, even though it must call mothers out of their homes where they're caring for their children, fathers away from their families in the evening so they can moonlight, the elderly away from their retirement and rest, as though poverty is declining as long as the GNP goes up, regardless of the kind of goods and services upon which that increase is based, as though we could cure poverty by studying the hardcore structural poor rather than by studying the hardcore structural rich. The economy and the institutions of the economy of the United States, like the economy of every other country in the world, with the possible exception of France, is committed to the soundness of each of these propositions. Our national economic policy, represented by the Employment Act of 1946, and a library full of implementing legislation, sets forth our policy of fighting poverty exclusively through full employment. But each of these so-called basic and self-evident truths is a myth, a lie. It is my hypothesis that wealth is produced by two factors, not by one factor of production. By the human factor, of course, but also by the non-human factor. That the real meaning of technological change, the major source of change throughout history, is that through it, man using his brain shifts the burden of production from himself to capital instruments, to land, structures, and machines. That man is a toil-hating creature, not a full employment-loving creature. That man has 2 million years of experience with private property in the means of production, and he likes his world arranged through secure private property holdings. Unfortunately, the only form of productive power with which nature equipped him in the first place was his labor power. Whenever he fought off enslavement, he was protecting that private property in his means of production, his labor power. But by failing to understand the nature of technological change, man has in fact been increasingly deprived of private property in the means of production. The productiveness of his labor power is declining through technological change at an exponentially increasing rate. At the same time, the long-established means of financing, that is, organizing the creation of the other factor of production, productive capital, effectively deprives the economically dispossessed worker of access to the ownership of that other factor. There is no effective way by which the man born without capital can buy it for it out of the wealth it produces and then own it for the stream of income it throws off. I.e., there is no effective and legitimate way for the man born without capital to acquire it. Yet, in the business world of the largest and most productive corporations, where about 80% of the goods and services are produced in our economy, new capital formation never comes into existence unless it will pay for itself in a short period, generally 3 to 5 years, and then continue to produce income indefinitely, its productiveness maintained by both physical maintenance procedures and by accounting procedures. This is two-factor theory. It holds that man is so created that his dignity and self-respect require him to produce as a basis for consuming. But this does not mean, as the pre-industrial understanding of the Puritan ethic would have us believe, man must produce in a pre-industrial manner in order to enjoy the output of industry. If the bulk of our wealth is produced by capital, and the ratio of capital input to labor input is constantly moving in that direction, then no industrial economy will function unless every man engages in production through his private ownership of capital, irrespective of whether or not his employment is also required. Our most pervasive problem in the modern world is that the young, the unemployed, the minorities, the middle class, indeed all but the top 5% who own virtually all our productive capital, are economically alienated. The productive power of their labor is shrinking in the face of automation, and our institutions are designed to prevent it from being restored through legitimate access to the ownership of productive capital. The tools of the Second Income Plan have been designed to correct this defect in ways that are beneficial to all concerned and harmful to none. They are designed to give every man in our economy, within a reasonable space of years, the power effectively to acquire a viable holding of productive capital, and in due course to make this possible for every man everywhere. Time does not permit me here to give you the details of these tools, but let me assure you that they are effective and they are being proven so in action today. They are consistent with the protection of the private property and capital for those who own all of it today, so long as they do not let their greed prevent us from building a vastly larger economy and structuring it so it becomes owned legitimately by those who do not own productive capital today. Their essence is simply to make institutionally possible what we have known for decades to be physically possible, the production of affluence for every family and every individual, while extending to every man the gift of technology, increasing freedom from toil. I now come to some of the main ingredients for a thoughtful rebel's guide to economics. First, let's recapitulate to be sure we see the picture. Two-factor theory holds that the human factor and the non-human factor each participate in production in the same sense, that it is private property and a factor of production that entitles you to receive the value the thing owned produces. Private property and your labor power entitles you to your wages or salary or professional fees. Private property and capital entitles you to share in the wealth created by that productive capital. If technically most of the productive input is by capital instruments, then most people must be owners of capital to make the system work. In a market economy, outtake is based on input. The way to get more outtake is to furnish more input. And the only way to do that is to own productive capital. I have listed for you some of the one-factor economic myths that are plaguing the economies of the world. Let me now correct these myths using real economics, or two-factor theory, and we now have some basic thoughtful rebel's guide rules to economic reality. Holding and performing an economic job for money is not synonymous with being affluent, for affluence is primarily the result of capital ownership. Equality of economic opportunity does not consist merely of equal opportunity to get a job, but also of equal and equally effective opportunity to acquire and own productive capital. It is not true that only human toil can legitimate the receipt of income, for the ownership of productive capital or an equity in productive capital fully legitimates the receipt of income produced by that capital. The function of new capital formation in any economy is not to create jobs, but rather to create more wealth with less toil and with fewer jobs, a fact which one-factor mythologists of the establishment effectively conceal by subsidizing phony jobs. The productivity of labor, with each advance in technology, is not rising, but rather is either unaffected or falls, thus forcing one-factor mythologists to resort to various kinds of coercion to redistribute ever more of the income produced by capital to the non-owners of capital, the workers and the unemployed. It is not true that one who does not hold a job must be dependent upon a dole or the voluntary efforts of others to help him. The ownership of a viable holding of productive capital produces excellent and legitimate and dignified incomes for the few who have such holdings. A job producing military overkill or napalm for natives is obviously not as good for the economy or the society as a job producing shoes or housing or food. The problem here is that the one-factor mythologists must invent jobs that do not depend on consumer spending, For under one-factor concepts, the consumers, 95% of whom own no capital, never have enough income. So a combination of jobs producing humanly useless goods and emergencies to frighten legislators into appropriating funds to pay for such perilous products is required. The proposition implicit in one-factor mythology that jobs created by setting the young of the world to slaughtering each other are quite as good for the economy as any other jobs is simply a desperate lie of the one-factor mythologists. We obviously cannot build general affluence on wasting resources and killing and crippling people. Engineers, managers, and scientists are not dedicated to the pursuit of the goal of creating more jobs. They are dedicated to the goal of producing more goods and services with fewer jobs, as few as possible. Some recent attempts by the one-factor mythologists to organize top U.S. corporations to launch a vast governmentally sponsored campaign to create jobs is simply irrefutable evidence of the intellectual bankruptcy of all one-factor mythologists. The maximization of jobs to provide full employment can never be a rational economic goal. The only defensible economic goal for any society is the production of general affluence and the general enjoyment of affluence through maximum participation in production by broad private ownership of productive capital and minimum economic toil. There is no human dignity in work that can be done by a machine. We can now see why poverty does not decline merely because the GNP goes up, because eliminating poverty requires production of the kinds of goods and services upon which human affluence rests. Clearly, we cannot cure poverty by studying the hardcore structural poor, for it is not general poverty we are trying to achieve, and people are not all that different, as the hardcore one-factor mythologists would have us believe. Rather, we must carefully study the hardcore structural rich, for they are the only affluent ones, and we should try to achieve general affluence for every family and individual. And the affluence of the hardcore structural rich is built upon the ownership of productive capital. Let me close with due apology to George Bernard Shaw by using two-factor theory to define some words commonly used in the one-factor lexicons of our day. I think this may further help to demonstrate what a useful analytical tool two-factor theory is, not only to beneficially design the future, but to understand the chaos and frustrations of the present and of the past. One-factor word definition in the light of two-factor theory. Conservative is one who favors the protection of private property, either his own or that of some owner to whom he has a master-serf relationship. Liberal is one who favors the redistribution of private property, the private property owned by others. Rising productivity of labor is the rising productivity of capital, not owned by workers. 100 months of full employment achieved through Keynesian economics and fine-tuning of the economy. 100 months of recovery from war, rehabilitating enemies and allies destroyed in war, stockpiling for new wars, refilling obsolete war material stockpiles, fighting new wars, rehabilitating enemies and allies destroyed in new wars, stockpiling for further wars, etc., etc. Guaranteed annual income is guaranteed annual obligation of the economically productive to support those made economically unproductive by one-factor economic concepts. Negative income tax is positive income dole. Toil state is an economy in which employment is contrived primarily to justify an income share rather than to produce economic goods and services in response to consumer market demand. Human resources is work units of the total toil state chained to the process of production, to be utilized at all times whether they like it or not. Exit from poverty is a synthesized job. A productive life is a synthesized job. The full use of our human resources is everybody in synthesized jobs. Develop abilities is prepare for a job soon to be synthesized. Decent standard of living is that minimum income necessary to keep poverty from offending the sensibilities of the affluent.